Welcome to the Encore Audio Archives YouTube channel. I'm Taper Dave, and this is my channel. I've uploaded hundreds of talks here that I've recorded at meetings in West LA, and I've also recorded conventions starting in 2013. I've got a bunch of those up. And Walt and Mary Murray, the original owners of Encore Audio Archives, started the company in the 80s, and Walt recorded Joe and Charlie's and a bunch of stuff down in Vista, California. My sobriety date is June 20th of 1994. I hope you find something you like, so please like and subscribe to my channel and comment down below. If you want to hear something that I don't have or that you don't see, I'll see that I get it. Anyways, take care and have a great day if you want to.
Thank you, Chester. I'm Po' Boy Rice, and I'm an alcoholic. Hey, y'all. I'm sober this morning by the grace of God, fellowshipping with men and women just like you, and because our program works. I am a member of the Glen Haven Stone Mountain group over in Stone Mountain. My sobriety date is December the 12th in 73. Now that may not impress some of you folks out there, but it just tickles the hell out of my kin folks. I want to take this opportunity to say thanks to the committee for allowing me to be on your program down here in Columbus. It is a privilege. I'm also grateful to have my friend Bob M. to come down here with me. Now you need to get to know Bob. Bob is my spiritual advisor. There may just be some folks out there that don't know Po' Boy. And I think it's only fair that I tell you in the beginning that I'm just a little bit old-fashioned and I'm kind of countrified. And the reason I tell you that is you never would have known it if I hadn't told you. And there just might be somebody out there that knew me before I got to this program, and so I want to tell you a little story. And this story is about an old buddy of mine who lived over in North Carolina, and he stole a man's milk cow. And they gave him 12 months in the chain gang, and when he finished his sentence, he was so ashamed of himself until he moved down in Georgia. And he got him a job, and he went to work, and he started attending a little old Baptist church down the road. And he established such a good record in the community and in the church until after a while he was elected to serve on the deacon board. And he served in that capacity for some time, and after a while the preacher resigned. And they asked this old buddy of mine if he would kind of fill in for the preacher until they could get him one. And he accepted. And on the first Sunday morning when he walked up in the pulpit to deliver his sermon, he looked down the aisle and he saw a long-legged joker come walking in there that he used to be in the chain gang with. And he started his talk off something like this. Now, brothers and sisters, I came here this morning fully prepared to preach to you from the book of John. But after observing this great congregation, I have changed my text to the 2nd chapter of Jude, where it says, if you knows anything, or if you sees anything that ain't already leaked out, you just keep your big mouth shut till this meeting's over with. And that's sort of the way it is with Po' Boy. Now, Bo, I did quite a bit of research before I found out there ain't no 2nd chapter of Jude. But it worked. It worked. In that book that says Alcoholics Anonymous on it, it says that our stories disclose in a general way what we used to be like, what happened, and what we are like now. And I just love to talk about what it's like today with po' boy. But in order to follow those good orderly directions, I'll have to touch on a few things that's not too pleasant to talk about. I was born a little over 75 years ago over here in Rockdale County. And my old daddy was a moonshiner and a sharecropper. And we lived on a big plantation. And all the people who lived on this plantation, they farmed and they made liquor for this man that owned this place. And up in the rear of his house, he had a little old commissary. And when we'd need something, you'd have to go up there to get whatever you needed. And those black people and those poor white people would have to go around to the back door and stand there with their hat in their hand and say, would you please let me have this, or would you please let me have that? And as a little old bitty boy, and I've stood there with my old daddy and watched him stand there with his hat in his hand and beg for something. And I resented that. Now, we know what that book says about resentments. And I began to resent everything and everybody as a real young boy. And maybe that had something to do with developing my personality. I remember in this old house we lived in over in the field, they had an old kitchen. You had to go across a little bridge to get into the kitchen. And there was two things that always sit in the corner of this old kitchen. One of them was a jug of moonshine liquor, and the other one was a jug of sorghum syrup. So other than becoming an alcoholic, I turned out to be quite a syrup sopper. And there ain't nothing wrong with sopping syrup, honey. And I don't know just how old I was when my old dad moved us to Atlanta. And we moved into a part of the city, and if you know anything about Atlanta, you probably know this part. They called it Cabbage Town. And then, as it is today, it was a real slummy era. I think everybody that lived on the street we lived on was a produce peddler or a bootlegger. And every little old boy that I began to associate with was a graduate from some reform school, or he was a candidate for some reform school. If he hadn't been, he was on his way. Now, Bob P., we all know what it's like to be young at some time or another. He was young one time. We like to be accepted by the people that we're so closely associated with. You are who you associate with. I'm no different from anybody else, and so as a real young boy, I wanted to be accepted by the people that I was so closely associated with, and so I began to do some of those things they were doing. And I well remember that when some of these kids' dad would buy them a bicycle, my old dad was so poor he couldn't buy me one, and I'd steal one. And a little bit later on, when some of these kids' dad would get them an old hot rod, my dad couldn't buy one of those, and I'd steal one. So I always had just as much as the rest of the kids, but mine was all hot. Now, they don't do this in Georgia today, but they did then. And this was in March of 1929. And I was 16 years old. And they had me up in that Fulton County courthouse. I found out that the law kind of frowned on some of them things I was doing. And I never will forget what that judge told my mother. He said, I'm going to send that boy of yours to the chain gang and let him see what it's like out there, and then I'm going to turn him back out. And I'm sure that your boy will be a better boy. And of course, we would believe anything that anybody told us, especially the judge. And so I went off to the chain gang, and I expected to get out that night or no later than the next morning. That's what the judge said. But it didn't quite work that way. They kept me 4 years. And so once again, of mixing and mingling with the people that I so closely associated with and wanting to be accepted, I had become a real smart aleck. Now, I've got another name for that, and I guess you have too. And I hated everything that stood for law and order, honesty, decency, and respectability. And that's what I was like when I came back out on the streets of Atlanta, and I drank liquor day and night. I couldn't tell you how old I was when I had my first drink of liquor. I was probably in diapers. My whole family drank liquor, and everybody we know drank moonshine liquor, and we didn't see nothing wrong with it. Just a short time after being released from the chain gang in a drunken stupor on the outskirts of Atlanta one night, I wrecked an old automobile and I killed Mama. And I never got over that for a lot of years and a long, long ways down the road. And I could hear Mama crying and pleading and begging me to slow that car down, and I wouldn't do it. I was a smart aleck, and I lost my Mama. And I lived with that guilt for many, many years. I've done a lot of inventory work since coming to this fellowship, only today I call it soul searching. And I can well remember so many times when my Mama wouldn't have streetcar fare, and she would walk in the rain or the snow or whatever down to this old chain gang camp to bring me a sack of Bull Durham smoking tobacco and say, Mama loves you and we hope they'll let you come home sometime. But this was Mama. And like so many young men today, we take Mama for granted. You are my Mama. You're supposed to do all these things for me, I thought. And then like so many mamas today, my old mother, she upheld me in everything that I did. Her boy just couldn't do nothing wrong. And so I lost my Mama. And then I continued to drink liquor, and I began to run with some of the worst people in this country. And a short time later, I was arrested, tried, and convicted, and sentenced to serve over 100 years. And so back to the chain gang I went. And my only hopes of ever being free again was to run out. And I run all my life and all over Georgia. And I escaped, or I attempted to escape from every institution I was confined in, except the last one. So many of these men that I was so closely associated with are not around today. Some of them were killed trying to escape from prison. Some of them were shot down out on the streets of the highway by our policemen. And some of them went to the electric chair. So my friends, it's by God's amazing grace that this old man stands up here this morning and tries to share a little bit of my experience, strength, and hope with you. Now, this was back in the days when they used the old sweat boxes and the stocks. And those old stocks, they would hang you up in them by your wrist and your ankles. And I've hung in those things until the back of my hands were paralyzed for several years after these things were abolished in Georgia. And those old sweat boxes was made like a coffin. It stood up on its end, and it had a door to it, and you backed up in it, and they closed that door right up against your face, and they would bore a hole there for you to breathe through. You couldn't turn around, and you couldn't sit down. And I've stood in those things until my feet would swell up and bust my shoestrings. And I suppose they whipped me with everything imaginable because I was a smart aleck. And I continued to get worse. And we don't win people like that. Sometimes today people will say, "Poor boy, how do we win people?" And I'm always glad to tell them that there's a little old four-letter word that says L-O-V-E, love. Thank God for this kind of love that I'm talking about. And this is why this is such a great fellowship. It is because of the love, the understanding, and the identity of one drunk working with another drunk. This is what it's all about. Eventually, the federal government built a place over there in Chattanooga County that we call Reedsville, which is one of our state penitentiaries today. And I was one of the first convicts to enter that new prison in October 1937. And they locked me in a little cell for 8 months until they could open up a rock quarry for incorrigibles. And I was transferred over there, and I remained over there for 3 years in that quarry. But I managed to escape on 2 different occasions, and they sent me back to Reedsville under what they called a stop order, never to be transferred out again. And a short time later, we got a new warden down there. And out of 2,500 convicts, he picked 10 of us with the worst escape records. He said, carry these men to maximum security. They'll never come back to population as long as I'm warden. Now, we had a lot of friends and we had a lot of connections. And 30 days later, we escaped from maximum security. And we came downstairs and we captured the whole inside of the penitentiary. This has never happened before, and it's never happened since then, but it did happen then. We've taken over the powerhouse, the front office, the switchboard, and I walked down through those cell blocks with a market basket full of keys, and I turned everybody out that said they wanted to run away. And so I let 100 out. And we threw that main switch, and we had a complete blackout. All the tower lights, inside, outside, everything went out at one time. And there was 25 of us went out those front doors and taken cars off of the yard and left. And the other 75 that I let out went down and broke into the commissary and got all that juicy fruit chewing gum and brown mule chewing tobacco. They didn't want to run away. They were just full of larceny and wanted to steal something. And so the governor, he offered a $1,000 reward, dead or alive, for every one of us. And within another month's time, we were all back in jail somewhere, with the exceptions of one little old 17-year-old boy, and he got drowned in the river that night. Now, they started what they called an 8-ball squad. Our heads were shaven. Those old chains and pick irons were welded around our legs, and we were placed out in a stump digging detail. And every state trooper in the state of Georgia would have to come down there 10 at a time and do 10 days guard duty over this detail, that they might know these men anywhere on sight. We were not allowed any visitors. We were not allowed any mail privilege. And life looked pretty hopeless during those days. We didn't even have any lights in our cells. So many of these men began to break their arms and to break their legs and to cut their heel tendons, known as a heel string, and some of them crippled themselves for life. And the word leaked out to Atlanta as what was going on, and the governor picked a group of men to come to Reedsville to make an investigation and come back up there and recommend something to do about this. He picked the president of the Senate, the speaker of the House, a lot of judges, probation officers, newspaper reporters, and photographers, and one other man I'll never forget as long as I live. His name was Mr. Wiley Moore. And Mr. Moore was a millionaire banker in Atlanta. And the governor asked Mr. Moore to head up this group and said the state of Georgia will back you up 100% in any recommendation you make. And so they came to Reedsville, and we were driven out of those old muddy river bottoms into that old dark cell house. And Mr. Moore said, open the door, I want to go in here and talk to these men. And they said, you can't go in there, it's too dangerous. And this was the first time in my life I ever heard anybody talk about God in a respectful manner. Mr. Moore talked about the God of his understanding. And he told those officials that he was not afraid to come in there. And they opened the door, and he came in, and we followed him to the rear of this old cell house, and we sat down in a big circle. And Mr. Moore sat down in the center of this group with tears just flowing down his face, and he brought us a message. He talked about the God of his understanding. He said, "This is not for sale. You can't buy it. And the most amazing thing of all," he said, "you don't have to be good to get it. That it's a gift. You just accept it." And I could not for the life of me understand what that man was talking about. But I never forgot that message, because I had all the respect in the world for that man, because he was for real and he was not afraid. He said, "I'm going to let your hair grow out so you'll look like a human being. I'm going to take these old stripes and these old chains off of you." He said, "I'm going to let you pick any job in this institution that you want, that you might learn a trade that'll be worthwhile to you one day on the streets." He said, "If any man in this detail would just do 5 years with a perfect record, I'll guarantee you a parole, because I'll hit you." What an opportunity. There was only one man in that detail that had taken advantage of that great opportunity, and as far as I know, he is the only one other than myself that's still living today. He's an old grandpa now. He did do 5 years. He was paroled. But you know what kind of job I asked for? I asked for a job down in the steward's department. Now, that's where they got all that meal and sugar and syrup and yeast. Well, we're liable to start identifying here a little bit. Now, you know, out there in the streets they call it beer, but in the joint they call it buck. I heard somebody say amen. Now, it ain't nothing but old still beer that you make liquor out of. And now, I learned all the tricks of the trade as a little old boy working around a liquor store with my daddy. And I can assure you that I drank alcoholically for many, many years in the penitentiary. Sometimes folks will say, "Poor boy, how do you get it in there?" I got news for you, honey. It was easy to get in Reedsville and did it over in Columbus. You didn't have to walk as far after it. You know, for the next few years, there was a lot of things happening. A lot of them were tragedies, and I don't talk about that. But there was a lot of humor along the way, and I like to look at the humorous side of life. Most everybody had a nickname. Now, they called me Po' Boy. And I had a little old buddy there, and they called him Hitler. Now, Hitler would weigh just about 75 pounds soaking wet. And if there was anybody in Reedsville that loved that old beer as good as I did, it was old Hitler. And I remember there one morning I had pulled off a batch of beer, and Hitler, he got drunk, and he got out there in the hallway, and he got arrested on a plain drunk charge. And they had him down at the control office, and the warden said, "Hitler, where did you get that buck at?" And he bowed over real humbly, and he said, "Captain, you can just whoop this old head of mine till it rattles like a pot of okra if you want to. And I'll never say one word against my good friend Po' Boy Rice. I just want to ask." Well, thank God we can laugh. I love to laugh. I believe it's some of the best medicine I've ever found in my life, Bo. I love to laugh. I love to see other people laugh. But when I laugh, I have to remember that one day I cried. How about you? Yes, Lord. If you've been there, you know what I'm talking about. I used this little extra privilege I had of mixing and mingling with the convicts and scheming and plotting and planning. And after a while, I got me an old pistol smuggled in there. And I got up there one morning, and I was so drunk I didn't know I was in this world hardly. And I enticed 5 of these other men to help me, and we captured 19 of those free people. And we had them all tied up in haywire, using them as hostages, and tried to go out the back gate with them. I thought I wanted out bad, but I can honestly tell you this morning, thank God I didn't get through those gates that time, because I would not have been living today if I had. And anything that I tell you that happened to me, don't you feel sorry for po' boy, because I asked for every bit of it. You know, I was in this fellowship for a long time before I realized and accepted the fact that I am responsible for my actions. And if I'm responsible for my actions, I think you're responsible for your actions. Yet I came to this program blaming people, places, and things for the condition I had got myself into. So they stripped me off naked, and they beat me till I was bloody as a hog, and I went to the death house. And there I remained for the next 2.5 years right in the shadow of the Georgia electric chair for safekeeping. Now, they don't use that thing too often today, but back during those years, the state of Georgia was leading this nation in executions, and I had a ringside seat. Now, this did not make a Christian out of me, but it certainly did change my attitude about a lot of things. 2.5 years later, I came back to population, and I had a thought like this: when I go again, I'll go out that front door a free man, or I'll go out that back gate in a pine box. I give up. I can't beat you. And in my way of thinking, for the next 7 years, I made what I called a good record. Now, I stayed drunk a whole lot of that time, but I stopped trying to escape. And by this time, we had a pardon and a parole board in Georgia, and prior to that, we'd had a prison commission, which consisted of 3 men. They were the whole works in Georgia. People began to take notice, and every year the board would come down and make a recording of my attitude and carry it back up to the Capitol and play it. But after 7 years, they said, "Poor boy, we feel like you have been in long enough, but you've been too closely confined for too many years to be turned out with the public." I didn't know anything about World War II. I had no trade. I could not express myself without using that language of the gutter. And those people knew more about me than I did about myself. I didn't know that then, but I do today. He said, "We're going to recommend that they send you out to a road camp and let you mix and mingle with the folks out there. And when you get used to being around folks, then we're going to give you a parole." And so they shipped me up to Cobb County. And they told my kinfolks that we're sending him up there on trial. And we're going to let him stay up there 1 year, and if he does good, then we're going to give him a parole. Well, I felt sort of like a misdemeanor then. I'd count the months and the weeks and the days off until that year was up. And they sent me another letter and said, "Stay another year." I could not for the life of me understand what they were doing. I couldn't understand that. I come to find out later on they did this for psychological reasons, to see if I could stand a little disappointment, because out here in these streets, we do occasionally run into some disappointments, and they knew that I was a real weak individual. And my attitude was, when my folks come out here to see me on Sunday, I'm going to get what little money they got, and I'm going to leave, because I could have left real easy then. But all these years that I had been gone, my little old sister and brother had grown up, and they had families of their own, and they had all become church people. And I never could understand why in the world they didn't talk to me about God. I guess they just thought I was a hopeless case. And I was so bitter at the state of Georgia, and I wanted them to feel the same way I did. And they dropped their head and they began to cry, and I didn't know how to fight anything like that. My sister says, "I know you don't have a God, but I do." She said, "There's a lot of people praying for you, people that you don't even know." please don't mess this thing up. Let me go back up to the Capitol. And I owed my sister a lot. She had run her legs off for many, many years trying to help me. But then, just like my mother, I took her for granted. You are my sister. You're supposed to do these things for me, I thought. And so she planted a little seed that morning. And I like to look at it this way, all the way down through life, at different times and different incidents, there were some little seeds that were planted. Mr. Moore planted one down in that old cell house that morning when he talked about the God of his understanding. And my sister planted one that morning when she talked about the God of her understanding. And I like to look at it this way. These little seeds that were planted, they began to sprout, and they began to come towards the surface until one day, thank God, they blossomed out in a program called Alcoholics Anonymous. I'm glad I'm here this morning and sober, and I hope I can plant a little seed or two. The next morning, the next day when I came in, said, "Po boy, you stay in the morning. Somebody's going to come get you and carry you up to the Capitol." And I couldn't hardly sleep on that old bunk that night for thinking about a God, a higher power somewhere that Mr. Moore talked about and my sister talked about. There was a lot of people up there representing me. I didn't know them. They were just friends of my family. The partner in the parole board said, "Well, we're going to reconsider, and we'll let you know what our final decision is in about 10 days or 2 weeks." And it was just about that long when they paroled me, and I'd been in 20 years, 1 month, and 2 weeks. And back in those days when you made parole, somebody would have to come pick you up and carry you home and bring you some clothes to wear. They didn't give you anything. And I never will forget, my sister brought me a sports shirt and a pair of slacks, and that was the first time in my life I had ever owned a pair of breeches that had a zipper on them. Now, honey, I want you to know that turned me on. I'd catch myself standing in front of the mirror going zip, zip, zip. And that's what I was like. And I thought, with all the modern inventions, I went home to live with my sister. Every time the doors of the church was open, my people all went to church. And it was sort of a take it or leave it proposition. Now, you can go with us or you can stay here by yourself. And so out of curiosity, I started going to church with them. I went for all the wrong reasons. I met a lot of wonderful people there, people who wanted to help me. But a person who had lived like I had so long, I kept everybody at a distance. You couldn't get close to me. And I refused that help. But there was one good thing that came out of me going to meeting. I met a little lady there, and there's some folks here that know this little lady, and her name was Flo. And about 30 days later, Flo and I, we got married, and we rented some furnished rooms, and 2 men in that church got me a job digging ditches for a plumbing company. I'm a good ditch digger. And I went to digging ditches, and me and Flo would go to meeting on Sunday, and during this time I didn't drink liquor. After a while, they gave me a dime raise and made me a plumber's helper. And I stayed with that until I got one of those little old cards that said that I was a journeyman plumber. And during this time, I was not drinking. And I said, now I can make some money. So I went out to Emory University, and I got me a job as a plumber. And I worked out there 2 years. I could just about wear my house shoes to work. I was sober. I was on the job every day. And one morning they called me in the office and said, "Po boy, we hate to do this, but your past has caught up with you, and we're going to have to let you go." And that just kicked the props out from under me. And my attitude was that no matter how hard I try, they just not going to let me make it out here in society. And so those resentments set in again. And that old attitude, I'll show you, I'll get even. And that old pride wouldn't let me go home and tell Flo what had happened. She would have understood. And we could have worked it out. She was a much stronger person than I was. But every morning I'd let her put that bread and meat in the sack, and I'd leave like I was going to work, and I didn't have a job, and I didn't want a job. I was mad. I didn't know anything about legalized liquor and beer. And so I walked in one of those honky-tonks, and I called myself getting even, and I began to drink that stuff. Then I began to drink the booze. And after a while, I wouldn't go home. I didn't want Flo to see me in the condition I was in. And then after a while, I couldn't go home because I was doing some things I ought not to have been doing, and the police was watching the house. And I knew I was going to have to run again. And I loved Flo, and I wanted to see Flo just one more time before I run. So I made connection with my brother, and he went and picked Flo up and brought her out where the little 5 Points is, and got me, and he carried us out there where South 75 is now. And Flo and I spent the night in a little old motel. And the next morning I woke up and I stood there at the bus stop, and I watched Flo get on that bus going back home. And Lord, I wanted to go home with Flo so bad I didn't know what to do. And I cried, and I thought, the most precious thing I've ever had, I've lost it. I've blown it again. And I run. And I went to another state. The trouble was I carried the problem with me, and that was po' boy, and that's where it had been all the time. And that liquor in these other states is just like it is in Georgia, my friends. And a short time later, the police picked me up in DTs just as crazy as a bat. They sent me back over to Atlanta, and they put me under a $10,000 bond. And my kinfolks put up the home, everything in the world they had to get me out on bond. So I could walk the streets at night by myself of Atlanta and cry and feel sorry for po' boy and drink liquor. And I run again, and I went to another state. And I was put in jail the first night I got there. I was walking up the streets of this city about 2 o'clock in the morning, nobody out there on the streets but me. Couldn't find nowhere to get no liquor. Everything was closed, couldn't find nobody to talk to. And I was desperate. And finally I saw those neon lights flashing, fancy wine and liquor. And I said, oh, here's one. Well, sure enough it was, but it was closed like everything else. They just left the lights on. And I stood there on that sidewalk, and I could look through that big plate glass window at those shelves that came up there, and they had half a pints and filths and quarts. So what did a crazy alcoholic do? I hit that glass with my fist, and it just fell out all over me and all over the sidewalk. And I just reached in there and filled my pockets full of those bottles and walked off up the street, uncapping one, and the police run up there and threw the shotgun on me and carried me back down there, and I lied like a dog. I said, I didn't do that. And they became very frustrated, and they said, how in the world are you going to deny something like this? I said, I don't know, but I am, and I did. And the next morning, there was a city detective that was trying to question me, and I was about to go into convulsions. And he was afraid that I was going to die on him there. And he said, I'm going to do something for you, but don't you tell them fellows back there about it. And he went and got a glass that high full of some of the best liquor I have ever drank in my life. And he said, drink that and don't die. And I drank that and I didn't die. And they kept me in jail for 5 weeks, and the grand jury met and failed to indict me. And they called me downstairs one evening, it was in the wintertime, and they opened the door and said, get, and I got. I thought they had made a mistake, and I run 5 blocks as hard as I could until I give out, and finally I said, these folks ain't all that crazy. They had some reason for turning me loose. But you know, I didn't know for a long, long time after that. I was in this program. I was up in Maryville in a meeting. And I was talking to a city judge from that town, and he's in the program. And I was telling him about that. And he said, "Po boy, I know what your answer is." He said, "That city detective that gave you that drink of liquor was a member of this fellowship. He was an alcoholic. And said he knowed a whole lot more about you than you did about yourself. Said he is the man that went before the grand jury in your behalf and said this man is an alcoholic. And if you'll just turn him loose, he'll go back to Georgia and we won't have to fool with him." And you know, he was so right. That's exactly what I done. I went back to Georgia and back to Flo to get what little money she had and to walk the streets at night and drink liquor and cry and feel sorry for poor boy. Poor, pitiful, and put upon, pour me another drink, Jack. Huh? And an old buddy of mine got out of the penitentiary about that time. We'd run together for many, many years. So one evening, just about dark, we were going up that 4-lane highway right near Marietta, and an old beat-up Ford, and both of us drunk. And we had a blowout, and we didn't have a spare tire. So we went across that expressway over there, and we bought a tire from the man who had a filling station over there. He said, "Now pull your car across over here, and this light hit the filling station. I'll put the tire on for you." So here's 2 drunks, and we're trying to get across that expressway. And there was a Thunderbird dealer from up in Ohio. Him and his family was on the way to Florida on vacation, and they run over us and tore up our car. And just like any other crazy alcoholic, we jumped out and took theirs away from them. And it wasn't so much as what had happened, but it was because of our background, our past. And they made a big deal out of it. And so they gave me and that old boy 20 more years apiece, and they sent us both back to Reedsville. And I couldn't see no way to live 20 more years in there. If I'd had the nerve, I'd have cut my throat. And I didn't know how to pray. But I know that Flo did, and Flo kept praying, and probably a lot of other people. And I like to look at it this way. About 14 months later, God answered somebody's prayer, but it was in a far different manner from anything I could imagine. They was building a new prison camp over in Stone Mountain Park. And they transferred me up there to put the plumbing in that new prison camp. And when we finished that prison, the warden had us to install a little chapel out in one end of the mess hall. And he called me out on the front and he said, "Po boy, I have a different assignment for you every Sunday afternoon. We're going to be having a different church group from all over this area will be coming out here and holding services. He said, I want you to stand by the door and welcome the visitors when they come in here. He said, I'm going to get some songbooks and I want you to lead the singing. He said, I want you to go back there in those barracks and form a choir out of those convicts." And of all the dumb things, I wanted to do it. But I knew I wasn't in no shape to do it. You know, our program tells us half measures avail us nothing. I've been believing that a long time. I don't believe in straddling the fence. I believe in being what you are. So I wanted to do what he asked me to do. And I didn't know how to pray, but I had seen other people pray up on death row. And I found me an altar, and here was an old black burnt hickory stump in the park. And I'll never forget it as long as I live, when I dropped down on my knees by that old black stump, and I said, God, if there is a God, whoever you are and wherever you at, I give what's left of old po' boy to you. I ain't going to run no more. Lord, I'm so tired. I'm so tired of that old dark, negative side of life. and something happened. And I could stand here and talk till the day after tomorrow, and I could never put into words what happened. But since that day, I've never wanted to rob, steal, or kill nobody since then. But I want to share something very important with you. He left me an alcoholic. And I hope I never see the day when I think I am cured, because I have seen what happened to some of these folks who think they get cured. I went back there and I did what the warden asked me to do. I welcomed the visitors. I led the singing. I formed the choir. And the good Lord sent one of them honky-tonk piano players in there, and I put that joker to playing gospel music and formed a quartet. He let me go out in the front yard with a bulldozer, and I built a baptizing pool and run hot and cold water out there. Oh, we turned it on. On Sunday, the little old folk would come out there and sit in those meetings out there. I still had that number on the seat of my britches, but I felt sort of like I was free. Something had happened. And I like to look at it this way. This God that I talk about don't have to be in a great big hurry about nothing. He's always right on time. You know, I did that for the next 5 years. And one morning somebody said, "Po boy, I just seen Flo go around the corner there with your Sunday britches, and it like scared me to death. I thought some of my kinfolks had died. Maybe I was going to a funeral." But that was not the case. Miss Rebecca Garrett was living then, and she was chairman of the Pardon Parole Board, and maybe she still had a little faith in me. I don't know. Because somewhere between 6 and 7 years there, she decided to parole me again. And I went home with Flo that morning. We didn't know hardly how to talk to each other. We couldn't hire a lawyer. We didn't have $1.50 between us. But in our hearts, we knew where our help had come from. I went back to work at plumbing work for the next 3 years, and then I got involved with a gospel singing group. You ought to heard some of my singing that, Jack. It was kind of a cross between George Beverly Shea and Piano Red. But I stayed real busy, and I didn't drink liquor, and I liked doing that. And then I took a job as maintenance man at a big hotel. And with all the conventions like Standard Oil Company and Shell Oil Company, the liquor and the beer flowed real freely. And I'd been on the streets for 6 years without drinking. I didn't know I was an alcoholic. And one day I decided I'd drink one of those good old cold Budweisers like these other guys was doing. I can take it or I can leave it. My friends, when you read in that textbook that this is a progressive illness, that it always gets worse and it never gets better, please believe it, because it's so true. How do you know, po boy? Personal experience, which is the best teacher of all times. And I got drunk. And I stayed down drunk for 1 solid year. Flo didn't know what to do with me. Nobody knew what to do with me. Somebody told Flo, said, put him over in Peachtree Parkwood Hospital. So she put me in the hospital. I went in there drunk and come out drunk. Now, they had a little deal going out there back in those days. They thought they could taper you off. Now, the first 3 days and nights you were in there, every 2 hours around the clock, they'd give you 2 ounces of 180 proof alcohol and a little fruit juice. And you better believe every 2 hours around the clock, I'd be standing at that nurse's station waiting for my medicine. And so I was still drunk and crazy when I came out of there. And we had spent what little money we'd saved up, and the insurance was all gone. And from then on, I'd have to go just wherever they would take me. And I was in and out of those places so fast it's a wonder I hadn't have died from exhaustion before I ever got to Alcoholics Anonymous. The last alcoholic hospital I was in was over at GMHI. And I'm sure it would have been the same old merry-go-round with the exceptions of one thing. On Monday night, they had an AA meeting. And there was some people from over in Rockdale County came out there to hold this meeting, and a very dear lady friend named Sue that was in that meeting, and she said that I looked more like a dead man than anybody she'd ever seen. And at the end of that meeting, she came over and said, "Po boy, do you want to get sober and stay sober?" And I said, "Yes, ma'am, I sure God do, but I can't do it. I don't know how." She said, "I'm not going to try to tell you how to do it, but I'll be glad to tell you how I did it." So here's somebody going to share something with me, and that meant a lot to me. She gave me her phone number, and when I left that hospital, that was the most important phone call I ever made in my life. I called Sue. And she got the little meeting book out and looked up the closest meeting to where I was at there in Stone Mountain, which is my home group today. And she said, "They've got a meeting over there tonight. You get yourself over there." And I went. I went by myself, very scared, very skeptical, very suspicious, very doubtful. I didn't think anything would work. I sat there in that meeting that night, and it was a discussion meeting. And them guys and gals would say, "My name is so-and-so, and I'm an alcoholic." And I thought, my God, if that's what an alcoholic is, what in the world am I? Because to get from where I was to where I could see those people would have been a high step up for po' boy. I think I picked up a little hope. I said, if I can just find out what these people are doing, maybe there's some hope for me. Maybe I can do that. And so I asked somebody, "What do I have to do to be like you folks?" And they knew I was a fool. And they said, "Don't drink and go to meeting." You see, if they'd have told me one thing more than that, I wouldn't have known what they was talking about. And so I didn't drink, and I went to meeting. Some very dear friends of mine in that group that was there when I got there, and they kept me real close to them. And I didn't drink, and I went to meeting. I argued about sponsorship. I argued about a 4-step inventory. You name it, and I argued. I'm the only man in my home group that they ever give a birthday party in 6 months. Nobody thought I could stay sober a year. Everybody felt sorry for me. I had an old boy as a member of my home group. He's a big old fat guy, and I just hated him. Because every time he'd open his mouth, he'd say, "The big book said that, and the big book said that." And I didn't want to hear about the big book. I wanted somebody to give me some credit for doing all these good things. Don't drink and go to meetings. I got the wrinkles out of my belly. I got to where I could lay down at night and go to sleep. I could get up in the morning, put my breeches on, and go to work. What more is there? The night that I had 6 months in, this old guy that was so mean, his little old wife baked me a cake and brought it to the meeting and said, "Po' boy, 6 months on it." The group conscience had voted that you had to have 6 months sobriety to be secretary, and this was the night they were going to elect a secretary. Now, you know how these little old AA elections go. Somebody said, "I nominate Po' boy." Somebody said, "Second that." Somebody said, "I move the nomination be closed." Second that. Said, "You're it, Po' boy." I said, "What?" He said, "You're our secretary." And I thought I owned my own group. And I'd go to the meeting, and I'd make the coffee, and I'd set up the meeting, and I'd tell people where they could sit and where they couldn't sit. But you know, I did celebrate a birthday. And I'll never forget the night that my wife came up and gave me my blue chip. And I thought, here I am, 60 years old, and there ain't nobody never give me a birthday party in my life. But tonight I've got a beautiful birthday party given to me by a bunch of sober drunks. That did something for me. But I lost that high office job as secretary and had to come down and be just a regular AA member. And that kind of did something to that old ego. And about 6 months later, those meetings started getting a little bit dull and a little bit boring. And I become very critical. My friend, that come as near getting me drunk as anything that happened since I come to this program. And I found myself sitting in front of a package store one night. I really didn't want to get drunk, but I couldn't help myself. And I couldn't understand till I got into this program and I found where it says there'll come a time we'll have no effective mental defense against that first drink. I know what they're talking about there. But I remembered something an old gentleman had shared with me when I was real new. And he said he was in a similar situation. And said he too sat in a parking lot one night and he begged God to help him. And just like he had talked about himself, I bowed over that steering wheel and I said, God help me, I can't help myself. And the help came. He's always right on time. I drove out of the parking lot and I didn't get the drink. But I knew that I was going to have to do something more than just don't drink and go to meeting if I stayed sober. And I decided I'd better get me a sponsor. Now guess who I picked for a sponsor? I picked that old fat boy that was so mean and talked about the big book. And I went to him and I said, would you consider being my sponsor? He said, po boy, I've already seen you celebrate a birthday. What makes you think you need a sponsor? And then I said something like I hear so many people in this program say, well, my program ain't working too good right now. And when he laughed, he didn't open his mouth, his old belly just jump up and down. He said, oh, yes, it is. Your program's working real good. He said it was your program that got you to our program, and our program is called Alcoholics Anonymous. And now if I'm going to be your sponsor, po boy, the first thing we're going to have to do is get rid of your little old program before you get drunk. He became my sponsor, and he said, what do you think about that inventory? I said, man, I don't know how to do that. He said, I know it. Will you start on it if I'll show you what to look for according to what that big book that's got Alcoholics Anonymous on it suggests? He knew just how to keep them props cut out from under him. I said, yeah. And he began to show me what to look for. And I began to work on an inventory. And about 6 months later, I called him one morning and I said, well, I finished my inventory now. I want to do the fifth step. He said, run that and buy me again. I said, man, I done finished the thing. He said, you got a 12 and 12? I said, yeah. He said, turn to page 50. I read it. It said 4-step inventory, but the beginning of a lifetime practice. Said, you through yet? No. Well, have you went as far as you know how? And I said, yeah. Then bring your inventory and come on over here. Me and my little wife went over there, and she stayed upstairs with his wife. He had the big book, and I had my inventory. And we went to the basement and locked the door, and I did a 5th step. Now, our program says having a spiritual awakening as a result of these steps. My friends, I want to tell you I had a spiritual conniption fit that morning down in that basement. I talked about some things I thought I'd have carried on to the graveyard when these things that burned and it bothered me for so long. And when I began to talk, it looked like it just gushed out. And being a good experienced AA member who had done a 4-step, who had done a 5th step, and knew what I was trying to do. And he shared with me. And when I'd done that 5th step according to my inventory, I want you to picture in your mind, if you can, here's 2 big old ugly men standing up there hugging each other's neck. And it was the first time in my life I ever told another man I loved him. And he told me he loved me. I've got one brother that's living, and I love my brother. But I want you to know I love my sponsor just as good as I love my brother. Because my sponsor knows a whole lot more about me than my brother does. When I got into making the list and making the amends, I needed this man. Had it not been for him guiding me, I know today that I could have really loused up some things. Since I came to Alcoholics Anonymous and became willing with God's help to try to live this way of life, there's been a lot of things that happened. There's been a lot of good things that happened to me. And one of the most major good things that happened since I came to this program several years ago, I received something from the state of Georgia that don't many men ever get unless they can prove their innocence, and I couldn't do that. But I received a full, unconditional pardon from the state of Georgia. Today, that record's gone. Free at last. Thank God I'm free at last. First time I'd ever been free since I was a little bitty boy. And I bowed my head and cried and said, thank you, Lord. This little lady that I talked about, Flo, just because we don't drink liquor, that doesn't mean everything's going to always be good. In June of '85, Flo and I had just come back in Sunday evening from Albany, Georgia. And the following weekend, I was supposed to have been over in Jackson, Mississippi for the state convention. And we hadn't unpacked. Tuesday morning, we was on our way to the Rockdale house to an AA meeting. And Flo had a stroke. And I put her in the Rockdale County Hospital, and they kept her on one of those life support machines for 15 days. And I lost Flo. And it's the worst thing that ever happened to me in my life. In August, I was supposed to have been in the Southeastern Conference in Louisville, Jack. And I said, I can't go. I can't go. I don't want to go. And Joe Phelan, trustee of the Southeastern AA here, friend of mine, and he said, "Po boy, you've got to go. You can't stop. You've got to go." And by the way, Joe don't care if I break his anonymity. He's just sort of like me. He got about as much anonymity as Sears and Roebuck. And so I went to Louisville. Jack might have been there. I don't know. And I'm glad today I went, because if I hadn't went, I don't know what would have happened. I'm married again. 6 months ago, I got married again. I just come back from California, and somebody out there said, "Po boy," said, "what do you want to get married again for?" I said, "Well, I read that sign that said, 'I am responsible. When anyone anywhere reaches out for help, I want the hand of AA to always be there, and for that I am responsible.'" It's been good. I appreciate being here this morning, being sober, and have the opportunity to share with you people. But anytime I'm in a meeting, whether it's a big meeting or a little bitty meeting, my heart and my mind is always centered on that new man and that new woman coming through those doors. God help us if we don't ever forget those new people, because one day we were new. And in closing, I want to share something with you new people as well as the old people. And this is based on personal experience, which is the best teacher of all times. And it's simply this: the problem that you have today, or the problem that may be out yonder in the future somewhere, it is never, never greater than this source of power that old Po boy stood up here this morning and tried to share with you. Thank you. God bless you. Till I see you again.
Sorry to interrupt your viewing. Taper Dave here. Just wanted to take a second to ask you to like and subscribe to my channel. Let me know if you like what you're listening. I've got some very good talks here, and this one's a great one. Just curious, do you think this is better than Zoom? Tell me what you think. Okay, this is how I prepare my drone for launching. I like to do it inside the cab of my truck so I'm not standing outside in the weather. To install the joysticks for control, up and down, right and left, powered on. I have an Android phone that I use to connect it to the drone with. And it's actually controlled through the iPhone, through an app. Oops, wrong way. It's actually controlled through the iPhone, or through this Android phone, through the app. It's actually controlled through the Android phone through an app, and you connect it through this short connection right here.
Remote control connected.
Remote control is connected. So I pull out the drone. I have to extend the legs. Long legs extended first, then the short legs. Remove the gimbal protector. Set that aside, then power it on one short burst and one long burst. I lay it down. So I have to go to calibrate. So the drone's not connected yet. It shows you here as this drone gets disconnected, even though the remote's powered on. So the drone has to establish it's connected. So I go into the app to calibration mode. First I'll calibrate the remote controller. Start calibration. Out, in, out, in, up, down, and then this little wheel is to control the gimbal. So it's calibrated. Go to gimbal calibration, start calibration, and then it calibrates the gimbal. I don't know if that shows up. The gimbal's moving all over the place. Changes, you can see it on the video. And I'm calibrated to take off. It's acquired 7 satellites at the moment. There are 26 satellites up in the sky, which it has to acquire before you can take off. So it's connected. It's got enough satellites. This is white. I can go to press this little arrow button, swipe right to take off, and it would start the motors if I slid this to the right, but I'll wait till I get outside. Don't want to do it inside.